Jeremy Gilbert, going to be looking at post-democracy in true provocative style, which I hope today's event is all about provoking discussion and debate. Thank you for that. And the following Jeremy, there will be Sean, who will be talking equally provocative style about uncivil society. If, as civil society, we need to engage, perhaps it is the fact that we have to be uncivil in the ways in which we actually pressurise for our interests. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Jeremy.
Okay, thank you. I'll stand up. I don't have any slides. Okay, hi everyone, thanks for inviting me. It's very nice to be on this panel with my old friend Charlotte. Okay, so Daniel and I sort of discussed the talk. We thought maybe I could say a little bit about this, some of the meanings or resonances of these terms, civil society and democracy, and then talk about how I see the general current situation in terms of how those phenomena are functioning. So, well, I mean, briefly, obviously, civil society is obviously a concept with a very old genealogy. You can trace it back as far as some of the earliest political writings, people like Aristotle, through de Tocqueville, through to certain kind of American 20th century writers. It's worth reflecting. It did take on a particular resonance on the British left in the 1980s for a number of reasons. Partly because of the interest in dissident movements in the Soviet bloc. In fact, it's worth reflecting. I'm not sure what this conclusion this is. Civil society was seen as being one of the things which the kind of absolute dominance of the kind of state politics in the Soviet bloc had crashed, had disappeared. They partly took on a certain resonance actually because of the reading of Antonio Gramsci's accounts of the development of modern political culture in the early 20th century. His understanding of civil society is an important element of the state, and an important element of the political in general, was a kind of important source for a lot of emergent left thinking at that time. But I would say also, in some sense more fundamentally, I think, that the kind of growth of interest in the very idea of civil society from the 80s onwards was part, as much as anything, a symptom of its decline, a symptom of a widely perceived contraction of the capacity of large groups of people, whether we call them publics, whether we call them communities, whatever we want to call them, to exercise kind of collective power in a way that could have significant impacts over their environments at any scale. And I think this was the reason for the growth of interest in partly the idea of civil society, in other contexts in the idea of the public sphere. I think often we get interested in things when those things seem to be contracting. And I'll say a little bit more in a moment about the reasons for the nature of that contraction. So this idea of civil society always raises important questions about how we can create institutional bridges between the formal mechanisms of government and actual groups of people engaged in whatever kind of social activity they might want to be engaged in. And we can give different names to those groups. On some scales, we might call them movements, we might call them communities, we might call them grassroots, we might, whatever we want to call them, groups of people trying to do things together in modern, highly technologised, highly administered societies. If they're going to be effective, often need to have some kind of interface with institutions of government. And civil society is sort of I think that's conceptualised as the domain in which the institutions which can mediate between them in some sense can exist and can function. And one of the big problems I think we face in our epoch is the relative decline of those intermediary institutions and their capacity to intermediate, as it were. I was trying to think of what are examples, historically, what are examples of those kinds of things functioning quite well. There are all kinds of examples one could take, but you could think about the fact that at its height, the Labour Party in Britain, at the height of its political efficacy, or the height of its membership, and its height of its ability actually to institutionalise and effectuate social and economic change around the middle of the 20th century was as much as anything able to do that because it was the sort of political representative of a much broader network and ecology of movements and organisations, many of which had played significant roles in what we now call civil society. It wasn't limited just to the trade, just to the labour movement, just to the reform decisions of the labour movement, or to the structures which existed to support the parliamentary party. Yeah, that's one example of this stuff working really well historically, and one of the big problems which I think all kinds of progressive groups and movements and organisations have faced, well, since not long after that, has been the relative decline of those models and the declining efficacy of those models of how you do those things. All right, so that's a few remarks on the idea of civil society. I can say something a bit more assertive about the idea of democracy. I think it's very important for me to be very specific to some extent about what we mean by democracy. But any definition of democracy has to imply some notion of collective decision making. It has to imply the capacity of groups to make decisions collectively about the things which influence them. Now, whenever I say this, and people just sort of look at me like I'm stating the bleeding obvious, which on some level I am or I should be, but I think it's important to assert this because it's very common for this particular aspect to just get left out of both popular and academic definitions of democracy. If you are, especially in the English-speaking world, and this is more the case in the States than it is here, but it's still here to a large extent. If you ask people in the street, what does democracy mean? They'll often give you, they'll often reel off a set of things like individual rights, freedom of speech, etc., all of which are essentially definitions of liberalism. They're not actually don't actually have anything to do with democracy. You can have personal freedom of speech and not have any real influence over collective decision, any real opportunity to participate in collective decision making. You can be allowed to say anything you like, and the fact that nobody's obliged to listen to you means you don't have any kind of democracy whatsoever. In fact, some sort of political philosophers in both radical and conservative traditions have pointed out over the years, and I think it's a good point, that taken to their logical conclusions, liberalism and democracy are contradictory principles. The principle of democracy is that a group of people can determine what happens within any given space, in any given situation. The principle of liberalism is that they can't, is that only private individuals can determine what they do, and that the wider collectivity, whether it's in the form of institutional, traditional forms of power or new or modern forms, doesn't have any influence over. So what we have in countries like Britain is what's traditionally referred to as a system of liberal democracy, and liberal democracy is not a kind of natural formation. There's no natural organic link between liberalism and democracy. In fact, it's a process by which you temper the worst possible of extremes of the one with the other. So I think it's very important to assert that when we're talking about democracy, we're always talking about the capacity of groups of people to come together and make decisions about the things which affect them and which affect their environments, what we define those environments socially, institutionally, economically. It's about the capacity of what I sometimes call potent collectivities to form. What I mean by potent collectivity is any group, any situation in which more than one person is capable of getting something done. And democracy always has to be about the enabling of potent collectivities to form. There's an interesting question that came up, sort of implied implicitly in Deborah's presentation, I think, about whether democracy is always about sort of the will of the majority. And I mentioned at the top that this really interesting early 19th century French writer who was kind of fascinated by what was happening in America, and to talk with is the source of the very famous definition of democracy as the tyranny of the majority. And this is the historic fear of the liberal tradition, is that if you don't check democracy, if you don't put limits on democracy, then indeed it will lead to the tyranny of the majority. You can reflect on, especially the history of Europe in the early to mid-20th century, and consider that maybe those fears are in some circumstances justified. It's always worth keeping in mind that Hitler won an election. He didn't just launch a coup. This is the sort of the tyranny of the majority. But on the other hand, now I think this raises the question as to whether democracy is necessarily what we call a majoritarian. Does it necessarily imply a situation in which whatever, in which indeed public opinion, whatever it may be, has to be the absolute determinant of what goes on in any particular situation, in any particular context. And I would say, well, sort of yes and no, to some extent. I think a really important issue to reflect on here is that there are no natural and spontaneous majorities in any given context, on any issue, or when we talk about any particular group of people. I think democracy, for it to be effective, it does depend upon, depends on one side or other winning particular arguments, and it depends on, on opportunities being created for people to have those arguments, which is why, on a certain collective scale, freedom of speech is very important. But it's a sort of mistake to think that majorities are just either defined in social terms, in terms of class, gender, race, sexuality, or in terms of opinion and ideological commitment, are simply sitting out there in the world waiting to be expressed by political institutions or waiting to be found by opinion polls or what have you. That any particular grouping, any particular grouping which gets large enough to acquire some kind of social and political mass, some kind of real efficacy, it has been assembled from others. I mean, even the idea that there are always enough potential differences between any two people for them not to be considered part of the same group, and there are always enough similarities for them potentially to be considered part of the same group. Now, on the other hand, for democratic politics in any meaningful sense to work, then it does have to be possible to assemble relatively large-scale constituencies who recognise themselves as both sharing, I think not necessarily sharing identity, but at least sharing interests, maybe sharing identity as well. And I think one of the things that's happened to societies all around the world since the 1950s has been that for various reasons, it's increasingly difficult to constitute effectively large-scale constituencies which are capable of exercising that kind of political force. In fact, I mean, historically, it's probably always been very difficult to do that in modern, in industrialised societies. I think one of the things we still live with today is the kind of legacy, the memory, of a particular moment in the history of industrialised capitalism when, for a set of relatively contingent reasons, it became relatively easy to assemble quite large groups of people and to make and for them to sort of recognise each other as belonging to very large-scale constituencies. But what I mean by this in concrete terms is, if you think about, the most basic facts of everyday life, the food people eat, the clothes they wear, the jobs they go, the jobs they do, how they spend their time. I mean, today in a country like Britain, these things are very highly variegated, and these things are very highly variegated even within different groups. And the example I always give to students is, well, if I tell you I'm a university lecturer, a professor, you know almost nothing about me. Apart from that, you don't know what TV programs I watch. You can't really predict what kind of clothes I'm going to wear. You don't know what my home life is like. And I say, if you consider, well, I mean, you say in 1955, that's probably not the case. 1955, you say about somebody who's a university professor, you know an awful lot about that person already. You know what kind of school they almost certainly went to. You know what their home life probably looks like. They're almost certainly married. You know what the division of labour in their home is almost certain to be. You've got a pretty good idea what kind of cultural consumption they're going to engage in, what kind of music they might be interested in. Does this make sense? And I think that's one symptom of the fact that we have this period, this relatively short period in the middle of the 20th century, which is really the epoch of mass industrial production. It's the epoch when the particular way in which capitalism works at that time, because of the technological limitations and opportunities, and the particular way that states and governments work, creates a situation in which you really get, arguably for the only time in history, what we might call sort of mass culture. You get millions of people doing very, very similar jobs, working essentially tied to manufacturing industry. Or, women, this is the one period really when women exit the workplace, especially when women with young children in particular, exit the workplace in a long mass. I mean, it's very important to remember that. But before the 1930s, most women with children still have to work. It's a middle class phenomenon, they don't. After the 1970s, they do. This is the era of the housewife. This is the era when Henry Ford famously says, yeah, you can have any colour you like as long as it's black. This is kind of when people's material, you know this quote from Henry Ford, famous quote? When people's material culture is really unusually homogenous. Now, under those circumstances, the form of sort of party democracy that we have today you can see why it might work. I mean, if you think about the assumptions which are implicit in our existing system of electoral democracy, they're based on the idea that you can divide up public opinion and social interest into 2 or 3 huge homogenous blocks, which are sufficiently homogenous that over a period of 4 to 5 years, somebody elected to represent that block of opinion can be expected to continue to do so reliably and without any real further consultation with the people they're representing, despite what come what may. Now, I think thought about logically for a moment in the abstract is a ludicrous proposition. I mean, if you think about the complex distribution of opinions and preferences and interest across a society like ours in 2016, it's a ludicrous proposition that this is actually going to work. You can see why people in the 1940s thought it would work. In the 1940s, it roughly did work. It more or less did work. You more or less get a situation, as far as any of the evidence available to us can prove it, that for at least for several decades, governments largely are doing the things which the people who voted for them thought they were going to do when they voted for them. And the great historical proof of that is that this is the one period in history since the Black Death when the gap between the rich and poor significantly shrinks. The situation since the 1970s is very different. Sorry? The situation since the 1970s is very different. And I think it's different as it's different as the result of the outcome, if you like, of 2 particular processes. I'll sort of go into what those processes have been in just a moment. I'll say in more descriptive terms first what I think the situation is. The situation since the 1970s is quite different. I mean, particularly in terms of the relationship between publics and governments. Insofar as, broadly speaking, governments have pursued a consistent socio-economic programme which has never enjoyed broad popular legitimacy. In Britain, for example, I would say probably future historians looking at British government policy in our epoch, hundreds of years from now, will almost certainly identify the privatisation of of the public sector as the key dynamic, which all governments have engaged in different ways since the end of the 70s. And since 1985, about the latest, no public opinion poll has ever showed majority support for this programme. I mean, none of the big programs. I mean, the privatisation of British Telecom was relatively popular. After that, the privatisation of British gas and water and electricity were not popular. The support for rail privatisation was something like 20%. I mean, and support for the New Labour programme of privatisation was virtually non-existent. It was quite different because it just wasn't reported. I mean, I think as most people in this room probably know, New Labour engaged in an extensive programme of privatisation, which simply wasn't widely reported. And at any time, you could go to any focus groups in the deepest blue part of Middle England and explain to people what the level of privatisation that the New Labour government was engaged in, and they would be horrified. It just happened anyway. And people didn't vote, and nobody voted for that government because that was what they wanted. And the same way. Instead, I mean, this does raise the question of why people have continued voting for those governments. And I would say, most of the evidence I would say suggests that, broadly speaking, people have voted for those governments despite not really supporting the broad programme, because the leaderships of whatever party they voted for has convinced them that they would at least that despite implementing this programme, they would continue to support people's private capacity to consume. I mean, very basically, we're often told that the only thing people vote on is economic competence. You're all familiar with this trope? I think we're never asked, well, what does that mean, actually? What does economic competence mean? I think what it actually means for people is I think this government will at least enable me to keep spending money. It will enable me to keep, buying plasma screen TVs and cheap holidays, which is the compensation we get for the social and democratic consequences of neoliberalisation. Now, I think in order for that situation, so this produces the situation which commentators like Colin Crouch, Jean Rancière and other people, myself, have called post-democracy, a situation in which essentially we have a situation in which a political class carries on pursuing a particular project, more or less irrespective of public opinion, more or less irrespective of what we think. And in fact, the mechanisms by which people are capable of influencing what governments actually do, continue to deteriorate to the point where there's very little, kind of match between what governments actually do and what any kind of reasonable measure suggests people would like them to be doing, apart from sustaining conditions for consumption. And even that since 2008 is really sort of questionable. I mean, really since 2008, as far as if you look at people's voting behaviour, it's largely a question of who's going to, people don't really have much faith that governments are going to continue to support consumption at pre-2008 levels. People are just largely concerned with who they think is the most likely, who's likely to slow down the long-term decline and things like wage level. Now, I said I would talk about this as being the outcome of two key processes, and I think so. There are two key processes that I think are really worth thinking about, which produce this situation and have made this kind of situation possible. One is the sort of pluralisation of cultures, which I've talked about, which I think you can see developing really from the beginning of the 1960s, the kind of emergence, both of fragmentation of culture and also the increasing capacity of society to tolerate a diversity of lifestyles, to tolerate a diversity of social identities, and also the emergence in the 1960s, importantly, of a whole range of social constituencies and political demands, which have become manifested as what used to be called the new social movements, feminism, being the most important, but not the only one. On the other hand, we can also talk about a process of individualisation, of privatisation, a process by which, and this is very widely documented, very widely commented on, by which people increasingly come to experience their lives as private affairs. They experience themselves not primarily as members of communities or groups, either on a national or a local scale, and in which all kinds of areas of social and cultural life are privatised, both commercially and in a kind of symbolic sense. And I would say that these two processes interact in complex ways, but I think it's important to understand them at least in an abstract way as distinct, because I don't think the one necessary. I think the key thing which happens from the mid-70s onwards is that this sort of pluralisation of culture becomes the condition for its privatisation, and I think that wasn't ever a necessary outcome. I think there wasn't a kind of inevitable destination of those processes. So, I mean, the way in which this gets manifest on a sort of social and political scale in a concrete way is you get, as I said, the emergence of a range of social and political movements from the 60s and 70s making various kinds of social demand, but at least in their earliest forms, none of those demands are demands simply for a kind of privatisation of culture. Women and people engaged in gay liberation are not simply demands, are not simply saying, leave me alone to live my life as a private individual. They're actually making a much more radical set of demands for a kind of democratisation of culture, for a culture and a society in which a wide and open-ended collective discussions and conversations about how we want to live, about what it means to be a good human being, about what kind of values should inform our social institutions would be had. And instead what happens, I mean really from the 80s onwards, instead what happens as a kind of alternative response to those demands from elite groups is a kind of privatisation, sort of individualisation, and a kind of depoliticisation of huge areas of the social and cultural sphere. And I think the consequence of that sort of privatisation and individualisation is that it becomes increasingly difficult for for individuals or members of small groups to coordinate themselves with others in meaningful ways which make any kind of democratic political action possible. Yeah, this isn't just my sort of speculative analysis. I think it's, I'm constantly citing this. I think about 3 out of 4 talks I do where you cite this particular moment, but right at the moment, the sort of peak of global radicalism, from the Black Panthers to the sort of movement in Latin America. In around 1974, there's this famous report published by a group representing a set of elite government operatives and think tank figures, calling itself the Trilateral Commission. It still exists. The Trilateral Commission has representatives from Japan, from Europe, and from America. And the American representative in that year or the American co-authored the report they published in that year is Samuel Huntington, who goes on to become the author of the Clash of Civilizations thesis, which informs much of American foreign policy in the beginning of this century. And Huntington argues that Western societies, at least at this time, are undergoing experiencing what he calls an excess of democracy. Is that they're becoming ungovernable because they are experiencing an excess of democracy. There's too much democracy being expressed through all these range of social and political demands, that the existing basis and social order of those societies is going to be challenged by them, and elites are going to have to formulate some kind of response. And I would say it's not hard to put together the history here and say that the response which they come up with is essentially to adopt the programme which we call neoliberalism, the programme which offers a kind of privatisation both at a kind of personal and social and cultural level and a political level as the response to these demands, ultimately as a way of disaggregating these potentially threatening new social and political constituencies. So this creates a situation, and this creates a general situation, the situation of what Crouch and others call post-democracy, in which the relative evisceration of the intermediary institutions, the democratic and civic institutions, is quite a deliberate process. It's quite a deliberate project of government from the 1970s onwards. I think there's an important point, there's an analytical point here. I'm going to finish that by talking about some of the concrete implications of this. For example, one of the consequences of this process from the 70s onwards is that all kinds of intermediary institutions, including civil society institutions, including local government, get eviscerated. They become less powerful, they become hollowed out. Now, I think it's very common to think that's what's happening. It's a thing you often hear from people in civil society actors and operatives, that what they have experienced since, say, the early 1980s is a centralisation of government. And what's needed is some kind of reversal of the process of centralisation. Some kind of devolution of power from central government. I think this is a sort of catastrophic analytical mistake. What's happened is not actually a centralisation of power. Is what in this country, for example, Westminster Whitehall has not accrued more power to itself. What it's done is destroy institutions of collective power across the culture, really, and especially locally, and essentially allow the private sector, as far as possible, to fill the vacuum, to accrue power to itself. I kept saying to people in Scotland last time, it's not, you always talk, I was supportive of the right to the independence campaign, but I kept saying to people, you do realise it's not that Westminster doesn't have all this power that you want. They've handed it over to the city. They've handed it over to PricewaterhouseCoopers. They're the people who got it. It's not the government. So, and this is why I think demands for devolution, for localisation, although they have a certain importance, often miss the point. They miss the point that government is simply, government has not accrued to itself all kinds of powers. It's handed them over. It's handed them somewhere else. And this is a key feature of post-democracy, and it presents real challenges. Because it's this sort of fantasy, still perpetuated by people like Liz Kendall, that if you get into government, you've got all this power, and then you can just stop handing it out to people. That's not how power works. The fact is, if we want to constitute alternatives to neoliberalism, then we have to constitute alternative forms of collective power. And those forms of collective power have to be actively constituted. They can't simply be, they can't just be sort of created ex nihilo by benign governments. And I think that clearly the voluntary sector and civil society more generally has to play a crucial role in that. There's another key kind of outcome of all this, and a kind of key sort of criticism I make of a kind of the normative responses to this, normal responses to this, especially amongst kind of civil society actors. Most of the kind of discourse that we hear about non-participation in politics, about people not voting, about apathy, tends to take a kind of moral discourse, which seems to think that, broadly speaking, the reason people don't participate, the reason people don't vote, is because they don't understand why it's important. And if they only understood how important it was, then they would vote and they would participate, and we could get them to do so. This is a complete misreading of the situation. The reason people don't vote is because they make a very accurate calculation that since the mid-1970s, hardly anybody has got what they voted for. People on the right who voted for Thatcher thought they were voting to restore the traditional family, to end immigration, to reverse multiculturalism. They got none of that. The people who voted for Blair thought they were voting for some restoration of social democracy. They got none of that. All they got was the neoliberal programme. That's why people don't vote, because the mechanisms they're being asked to participate in are clearly ineffectual. And in fact, it's only the kind of professional classes, okay, this is true across Europe, it's the professional classes and the sort of journalistic classes who I think remain the most deluded group of people. They're the only people who still think that if only you vote for a nice bloke, that a whole 30-year history of class antagonism will be reversed. And it's crucial to get over that illusion. And I think ultimately it's crucial to recognise that under such circumstances, we need a complete rethink to something. We need a completely new set of democratic different and probably new types of political and social institution. And I think we really need to be thinking about a whole new democratic settlement, or raising sort of demands for a whole new democratic settlement. Whether that means talking about co-production of services in public services as a kind of democratic objective, whether it means supporting things like the radicalised Constitutional Convention, which John Trickett has been asked to coordinate with no money. And I think it's also and it's finally reflecting that there are people starting to do some of this, or there are people that are doing this in important ways. I've talked about Trickett in the Constitutional Convention. In terms of this kind of analysis I make in the kind of politics I'm talking about, it's a huge gain. It's one we're almost certainly going to lose. I mean, the odds against anything productive coming out of it are huge, but for the first time, we have a senior politician who has been tasked with doing something about it. And Trickett is completely on board with this kind of analysis that I'm offering here, actually. Across some sections of civil society, there have been really significant attempts to reverse or to counteract the effects of neoliberal hegemony. Well, I should say, when I talk about neoliberal hegemony, I'm talking about, this is a kind of abstract terminology, but really I'm simply talking about exactly the situation that was described in the previous session. I mean, the situation within which people working in organisations whose objectives are ultimately clearly and whose objective interests run counter to the whole neoliberal programme, nonetheless feeling themselves completely constrained and unable to challenge it because they recognise that a particular agenda, a particular set of interests is so powerful and is so capable of setting the public agenda that it's not really challengeable. That's what hegemony looks like. That's exactly what it means. What it doesn't mean, people often mistake, it doesn't mean everybody loving neoliberalism or think it's a really good idea. It doesn't mean that at all. It means, it more accurately means a situation in which people just feel it can't be challenged, even though they might privately disagree with it. But in order to challenge it, obviously, to some extent, what's required is a sort of politicisation of those sectors and a politicisation of those groups. And I think there's very good work going on in some of those areas. So I've done a lot of work over the past couple of years with this organisation set up by New Economics Foundation, NEON, the New Economy Organisers Network, which is specifically really a project to try to re-politicise the NGO sector. I mean, that's what it began as. It began as a project to re-politicise the NGO sector based on a recognition of the extent to which it had been captured by sort of neoliberal common sense. And the growth at NEON, which has grown from like a couple of hundred people to thousands, and it's kind of the growth of its activities over the past couple of years, along with things like the election of Jeremy Corbyn, which was kind of something unimaginable sort of 18 months ago. I think it does indicate that we may be coming. I think we are now at the end of the phase when people across the culture and across civil society don't believe these things can be challenged at all. I don't think we're yet in some new historical phase. We're not where the social democratic project can be reinvigorated in the 20th century. The neoliberals still exercise enormous degrees of power and authority, but I think we are coming to the end of the period that was sort of described so eloquently in the previous session, whereby people simply can't think outside of those limitations, which I think is a reason for some optimism. Sorry, right.